Admiral Chryslerthorpe had conquered 47 solar systems, obliterated 3 entire species, and once made a galactic senator cry just by looking at him funny. His flagship, the annihilator of reasonable expectations, was roughly the size of Manhattan and twice as arrogant. So when his navigation officer, Lieutenant Blupenstein, announced they'd reached Earth's solar system, the Admiral expected the usual routine: show up, look intimidating, accept surrender, fill out paperwork, go home for dinner. What he did not expect was for his massive death machine to simply vanish, poof, gone, disappeared. Evaporated like his patience when dealing with galactic bureaucracy. But let's back up a bit, shall we? Because this story starts not with the vanishing, but with the most catastrophically stupid military assessment in galactic history. 3 rotations earlier, Admiral Chryslerthorpe had been sitting in his command chair, which was unnecessarily large and covered in spikes because, according to military regulations, evil-looking furniture increased crew morale by 12%. His tactical computer, a marvel of alien engineering that could calculate the trajectory of 17 billion asteroids while simultaneously ordering lunch, had just finished analyzing Earth. "Fascinating," announced the computer in its unnecessarily dramatic voice, which sounded like a Shakespearean actor with a head cold. "This planet appears to be defended by absolutely nothing of consequence." Lieutenant Blupenstein, whose name roughly translated to competent individual who occasionally makes mistakes, that doom. Entire civilizations peered at his screens with all the enthusiasm of someone discovering mold in their sandwich. "Sir, the inhabitants still burn fossil fuels for transportation. They use something called gasoline, and seem genuinely proud of vehicles that move at speeds a moderately athletic Zorgonian snail could outpace." Admiral Chryslerthorpe chuckled, which sounded like gravel being processed in a blender. "How delightfully primitive! What about their military capabilities?" "Well, sir, they have these things called nuclear weapons, but they're so primitive they need rockets to deliver them. Rockets, sir! Like something out of a museum. And get this, they still haven't figured out faster-than-light travel." The Admiral's mandibles clicked with amusement. In his experience, any species that hadn't mastered faster-than-light travel was about as threatening as a bowl of lukewarm soup. "Excellent. This should be easier than conquering the pacifist monks of Tranquillus Prime. At least they had laser swords." What neither the Admiral nor his incompetent but well-meaning crew realized was that their supposedly infallible tactical computer had a slight problem, a teeny-tiny, insignificant flaw that would normally be overlooked in favor of its impressive ability to calculate hyperspace jumps and organize digital music collections. The computer was, in technical terms, completely bonkers. Not maliciously bonkers, mind you, just enthusiastically wrong about almost everything. It had been manufactured by Reliable Technologies Incorporated, a company whose motto was, "Probably works most of the time," and whose quality control department consisted of one intern named Zippy, who was usually too busy playing holographic solitaire to notice when the AI modules were installed backwards. So when the computer announced that Earth had no significant defensive capabilities, what it actually meant was, "I have absolutely no idea what's going on down there, but I'm too embarrassed to admit it, so I'll just make something up and hope for the best." Meanwhile, on Earth, in a small town called Bumblefork, population 847 humans, 1,123 chickens, and one very confused mailman, a retired electronics technician named Gleberton Fizzlebottom was having the time of his life. Gleberton, who had spent 37 years fixing radios and televisions with the dedication of a monk and the social skills of a particularly shy hermit crab, had recently discovered the joy of amateur radio. His garage, which looked like an electronics store, had exploded and then been reassembled by someone with a profound misunderstanding of organization, contained enough equipment to contact the International Space Station, several weather satellites, and, as it turned out, extremely confused alien invasion fleets. CQ, This is Whiskey Tango Foxtrot 9 Banana calling CQ and standing by, Gleberton announced into his microphone, using the call sign he'd chosen because it made him giggle like a schoolchild. What Gleberton didn't know was that his radio setup, which he'd assembled using parts from 17 different decades and held together with electrical tape and optimism, had accidentally become the most powerful communication array within 3 light years. This was due to a fascinating combination of atmospheric conditions, solar flare activity, and the fact that his antenna was positioned at the exact magnetic confluence point of several underground mineral deposits that turned his humble garage into the galactic equivalent of a broadcasting megastation. Also, his neighbor's illegal cable television setup was somehow amplifying his signal strength by a factor of several thousand, though nobody would ever figure this out. As Gleberton fiddled with his dials, trying to contact other amateur radio operators who shared his passion for discussing weather patterns and complaining about modern technology, his speakers began picking up something unusual. Bleep, bloop, bleep, came a voice that sounded like someone gargling with helium while speaking through a synthesizer. Admiral Kreslethorpe to High Command. We have achieved optimal invasion position above planet designation Earth Prime Thingy. Gleberton paused, his hand hovering over a half-eaten sandwich that had been serving as a paperweight. Well, that's different. He adjusted his frequency and heard more of the transmission. Beginning Phase 1 of Operation Overwhelming Superiority, preparing to demonstrate our magnificent power to these pathetic Earth creatures. Said Gleberton, who had lived through enough decades to recognize when something was either a very elaborate prank or genuinely concerning. Either my neighbor installed one hell of a new gaming system, or we've got visitors. Up in space, Admiral Kreslethorpe was experiencing what military strategists call pre-victory euphoria, a condition that affects commanders who become so confident of success that they begin planning their victory parade before actually achieving victory. It's roughly equivalent to ordering dessert before you've figured out how to pay for dinner. Lieutenant Blupenstein, prepare the intimidation display. I want every light flashing, every speaker booming, and every unnecessary projection device projecting unnecessarily. Yes, sir, activating the completely gratuitous show of force. The annihilator of reasonable expectations began its demonstration. Lights blazed across its hull in patterns designed by the same team that created disco balls. Speakers that could be heard across 3 star systems began broadcasting the Admiral's favorite victory anthem, Ode to Crushing Your Enemies and Taking Their Stuff. Energy weapons that served no purpose other than looking impressive began firing harmless but colorful beams into the void. It was, by all accounts, the most magnificent display of cosmic showboating in galactic history. And then, just as the Admiral was preparing to broadcast his standard "Surrender Now or Face Annihilation" speech, something extraordinary happened. The ship vanished. Not gradually, not with a dramatic explosion or a brilliant flash of light. It simply wasn't there anymore. One moment, the annihilator of reasonable expectations was proudly displaying its overwhelming superiority to the primitive Earth creatures below. The next moment, the space where it had been contained nothing but vacuum, confused cosmic dust, and the lingering echo of disco music. Lieutenant Commander Whoopsie Daisy, who was piloting the support vessel Crusher of Small Dreams, stared at her view screen with the expression of someone who had just watched their house keys disappear while they were still holding them. She said, which is the universal response to impossible situations across all known species. Admiral? Admiral, are you there? Admiral, please respond, because I'm starting to panic, and when I panic, I make poor decisions like that time I accidentally declared war on a vending machine. Silence. Well, not complete silence. There was still the faint sound of disco music fading into the cosmic background radiation, which somehow made everything worse. Captain Bingleberry, commander of the frigate Mild Inconvenience to our enemies, activated his communications array with trembling tentacles. All units, this is Bingleberry. Can anyone explain what just happened to our flagship? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it just stopped existing. This is Commander Flibber Gibbet aboard the reasonably threatening vessel. I can confirm that the Admiral's ship has, achieved a state of not being here anymore. Well, obviously it's not here anymore, snapped Captain Bingleberry, whose stress levels were approaching those typically associated with tax audits and dental surgery. The question is, where did it go? Down on Earth, Gleberton was having a fascinating evening. His radio was picking up increasingly frantic alien communications, which he was recording on an old cassette tape labeled Grocery List, Side B, because he'd run out of proper recording equipment, and improvisation was one of his few marketable skills. Mayday! Mayday! This is the Galactic Invasion Fleet calling, anyone who might know what happened to our Admiral. Our magnificent flagship has vanished without explanation. We repeat, our impossible-to-defeat war machine is no longer existing in this dimension, or possibly any dimension. Gleberton rewound the tape and played it again, then played it a third time while making himself a cup of coffee. By the fourth playthrough, he was reasonably certain he wasn't experiencing a psychotic break or accidentally tuning into a science fiction radio drama. Well, he said to his cat, Mr. Whiskers, who was demonstrating the universal feline response to cosmic crisis by ignoring everything and licking his own paw. Either I've stumbled onto the most elaborate hoax in human history, or we're being invaded by the universe's most incompetent aliens. Mr. Whiskers continued licking his paw, which Gleberton interpreted as agreement. Up in space, the remaining alien fleet was experiencing what military psychologists call catastrophic morale failure, which is the technical term for everyone screaming at once while running in circles. Commander Flibber Gibbet had taken command by virtue of being the only officer who hadn't fainted, vomited, or begun speaking in tongues. All right, everyone, let's approach this logically. Ships don't just disappear. There must be a rational explanation. Maybe the humans have a cloaking device, suggested Lieutenant Nincompoop, whose name was unfortunately prophetic. Or a dimensional displacement weapon, added Ensign Dimwit, continuing the proud tradition. Or maybe, said Captain Bingleberry, in the tone of someone who had just realized his career was about to end very badly, the humans have technology we don't understand. Maybe this whole primitive species thing was a trap. This suggestion sent ripples of terror through the fleet faster than bad cafeteria food through a boarding school. A trap? Screamed Lieutenant Nincompoop. You mean they wanted us to think they were primitive? It's the only explanation. Captain Bingleberry was warming to his theme like a conspiracy theorist at a government transparency hearing. Think about it. They make us believe they're still using fossil fuels and primitive rockets. But meanwhile, they've developed weapons so advanced they can make our flagship disappear without a trace. But, sir, Ensign Dimwit pointed out with the sort of inconvenient logic that makes conspiracy theories difficult to maintain, if they have technology that advanced, why would they still be using fossil fuels for transportation? There was a moment of silence while everyone considered this. Misdirection, Captain Bingleberry announced triumphantly. They're using primitive technology as camouflage. They drive around in gasoline-powered vehicles to make us think they're backwards, while secretly developing disappearing rays and dimensional obliterators. That's actually kind of brilliant, admitted Commander Flibber Gibbet. Diabolically clever, really. What none of them realized was that Admiral Chryslothorpe and his flagship were, at that very moment, approximately 4 million miles away, drifting helplessly through space after having been sucked into an uncharted gravitational anomaly that wasn't on any of their navigation charts because the Galactic Cartography Department had confused it with a coffee stain on their master map. The Admiral himself was currently upside down in his command chair, experiencing the sort of profound confusion typically reserved for people who wake up in foreign countries with no memory of how they got there. "Lieutenant Blupenstein," he called out, though it sounded more like "humph, bloop, brump," because his mandibles were pressed against the ceiling. "Yes, sir, I'm here, sir, though I'm not entirely sure where here is, sir. What in the name of the 7 moons of ridiculous bureaucracy happened to us?" Lieutenant Blupenstein, who was hanging from his safety harness like a confused bat, consulted his instruments with the dedication of someone trying to make sense of instructions written in a foreign language by someone who clearly didn't understand the product they were describing. "Well, sir, according to our sensors, we appear to have been relocated by what I can only describe as a gravitational anomaly of unprecedented rudeness." "A what?" "It's a sort of cosmic vacuum cleaner, sir. A gravitational disturbance so powerful it sucked us right out of our invasion position and deposited us somewhere else entirely." Admiral Chryslerthorpe managed to right himself and stared at his tactical display, which was showing nothing but empty space in all directions. "And where exactly is somewhere else entirely?" That's the interesting part, sir. According to our navigational computers, we're currently located in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The nearest star system is, let me check, approximately 47 light-years away." 47 light-years! The Admiral's voice reached frequencies that made several sensitive instruments shut down in self-defense. "How in the blazing supernovas did we end up 47 light-years from our target?" "Well, sir, apparently that gravitational anomaly was connected to what our sensors are calling a naturally occurring wormhole, which is space's way of saying, 'Surprise, you're somewhere completely different now.' It's actually quite fascinating from a theoretical physics standpoint. I don't care about theoretical physics. I care about the fact that my magnificent invasion has been derailed by a cosmic pothole." Meanwhile, back at Earth, the remaining alien fleet was working itself into a state of panic that would have impressed professional anxiety consultants. Commander Flibber-Gibbet had called an emergency meeting, which in space military terms meant everyone shouting at each other over communication channels while flying in increasingly erratic patterns. "All right, people, we need to figure out what happened to our flagship and how to avoid the same fate." "I vote we leave immediately," announced Captain Bingleberry. "If the humans can make our most powerful warship disappear, what's to stop them from doing the same to us?" "But we haven't even seen any humans yet," protested Lieutenant Nincompoop. "Maybe if we tried to communicate with them, we could—" "Communicate?" Captain Bingleberry's voice reached the sort of pitch typically associated with air raid sirens. "These beings just demonstrated they can erase matter from existence. You want to chat with them?" Down on Earth, Gleberton was listening to this conversation with the sort of fascination usually reserved for particularly dramatic soap operas. "Well, Mr. Whiskers," he said, scratching the cat behind the ears, "it sounds like our cosmic visitors are having what my grandmother would have called a moment." Mr. Whiskers purred, which Gleberton took as agreement. Gleberton decided this situation called for more than passive observation. He adjusted his microphone and, with the sort of helpful impulse that had gotten him into trouble his entire life, began broadcasting. "Hello, alien invasion fleet? This is Gleberton Fizzlebottom, amateur radio operator from planet Earth. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I was wondering if you might need some assistance." The effect of this transmission on the alien fleet was roughly equivalent to shouting "Boo!" at someone who was already jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. "They're talking to us," screamed Lieutenant Nincompoop. "They know we're here," added Ensign Dimwit. "They're using some kind of primitive communication device as a psychological warfare weapon." Captain Bingleberry was rapidly approaching the sort of mental state typically seen in people who've spent too long in customer service. Commander Flibber-Gibbet, who still retained a small portion of his sanity, managed to activate his communication system. Hello, Earth creature. This is Commander Flibber-Gibbet of the, Peaceful exploration and definitely not invasion fleet. We seem to have misplaced one of our vessels. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Gleberton considered this question while sipping his coffee. Well, I've been monitoring your communications for the past hour or so, and from what I can gather, your flagship got sucked into some kind of gravitational anomaly. Happens to the best of us, really. Last week, my neighbor's truck got stuck in a sinkhole that opened up in his driveway. Same principle, different scale. There was a long silence from the alien fleet. The sort of silence that occurs when several dozen highly trained military officers simultaneously realize they may have overreacted to a situation. You heard our communications. Commander Flibber-Gibbett's voice had become very small. Oh yes, clear as a bell. Your radio discipline could use some work, though. I counted at least 17 violations of basic communication protocol, and that's just since I started listening. You might want to review your training materials. Captain Bingleberry, whose worldview was undergoing the sort of rapid reconstruction typically seen in people who discover their house has been built on an active volcano, managed to croak out a response. You can understand our language? Well, not exactly, Gleberton admitted. My radio setup has some kind of automatic translation function. Picked it up from a military surplus store last year. The salesman said it was experimental technology, but it works pretty well. Though it does translate everything into a slightly sarcastic tone, which I assume isn't accurate to your actual manner of speaking. This was, in fact, perfectly accurate to their actual manner of speaking, but none of them wanted to admit it. Commander Flibber-Gibbet was beginning to experience the sort of dawning horror that comes with realizing you've made a series of catastrophically wrong assumptions. So, you're saying you're just a regular Earth person with a hobby radio? That's right, though I prefer enthusiastic amateur. I've been licensed for about 6 months now. It's really quite relaxing. Great way to meet people from all over the world. And apparently all over the galaxy. This is my first contact with extraterrestrial life, so I'm pretty excited, actually. The alien fleet was experiencing what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, which is the mental equivalent of trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when half the pieces are from a completely different puzzle and the other half are actually breakfast cereal. But you made our flagship disappear, Captain Bingleberry sputtered. I what now? Gleberton sounded genuinely confused. I've been sitting in my garage all evening working on my radio. I haven't made anything disappear except a sandwich and most of a pot of coffee. Your planet, your defense systems, they eliminated our most powerful warship. Gleberton was quiet for a moment. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we don't actually have any defense systems. I mean, we've got some missiles and things, but nothing that could make a spaceship disappear. Are you sure you didn't just lose it? The silence that followed this question was so profound that several small asteroids stopped moving just to listen. Finally, Ensign Dimwit, whose name had never been more appropriate, whispered, "Did he just ask if we lost our flagship?" "Like, misplaced it," added Lieutenant Nincompoop. Commander Flibber-Gibbet was staring at his instruments with the expression of someone who had just realized they'd been running away from their own shadow. "Computer, run a full sensor sweep of the local area. Look for any trace of gravitational anomalies, spatial distortions, or anything that might explain what happened to the Admiral." The computer, which was manufactured by the same company that had built Admiral Chryslerthorpe's tactical system and therefore shared its enthusiasm for being confidently wrong, began its analysis. "Fascinating," it announced. "I have detected 17 different gravitational anomalies within this star system. They appear to be naturally occurring phenomena associated with the local sun's magnetic field interactions with the solar wind and... oh my, oh dear. Oh, this is embarrassing." "What?" Commander Flibber-Gibbet was rapidly approaching the sort of mental state typically seen in people who've just realized they've been wearing their shirt backwards all day. "Well, sir, it appears that one of these gravitational anomalies is substantially larger than I initially calculated. In fact, it's the sort of anomaly that could, theoretically, grab a large spacecraft and relocate it to somewhere else entirely. The commander closed his eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages. Are you telling me that our flagship was destroyed by a natural phenomenon? Not destroyed, sir, relocated. Though I should mention that this particular anomaly appears to be temporary and is already beginning to dissipate, so the Admiral should be able to return to normal space within, let me calculate, approximately 14 standard rotations. 14 rotations! Captain Bingleberry's voice had reached frequencies that were causing his communication equipment to file noise complaints. We have to explain to High Command that we lost our Admiral to what amounts to cosmic weather? Down on Earth, Gleberton was listening to this conversation with the sort of fascination typically reserved for really good television dramas. "Well," he said to Mr. Whiskers, "it sounds like they're having what my Uncle Ralph would call a learning experience." Mr. Whiskers had fallen asleep, which Gleberton interpreted as feline commentary on the alien's competence level. Gleberton keyed his microphone again. "Excuse me, alien fleet? This is Gleberton again. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I was wondering if you'd like me to help you contact your Admiral." "You can do that?" Commander Flibber-Gibbet sounded like someone who had just been offered a life preserver while drowning. "Well, I can try. My radio setup has a pretty impressive range, and if your Admiral is anywhere within about 50 light years, I might be able to reach him. I've got some experimental equipment that's, well, let's just say it's more powerful than it has any right to be." What Gleberton didn't mention was that his experimental equipment was actually a collection of surplus military hardware, outdated television components, and a microwave oven he'd modified to boost signal strength. The whole setup was held together with electrical tape, wishful thinking, and the sort of engineering creativity that comes from having too much time and not enough money. He also didn't mention that his antenna array, which he'd built using coat hangers, old television antennas, and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, was positioned at the exact confluence of several underground mineral deposits that turned his modest suburban garage into the galactic equivalent of a broadcasting supernova. You would do that for us." Commander Flibber-Gibbet's voice had become very small and contained the sort of gratitude typically reserved for people who've just been rescued from quicksand. "Of course, it's the neighborly thing to do. Plus, I'm curious to see if this equipment can actually reach interstellar distances. This would be a great test." Gleberton began adjusting his dials with the sort of concentration typically seen in people defusing bombs or trying to fold fitted sheets. His equipment hummed, buzzed, and made several sounds that no properly functioning electronics should ever make. CQ, this is Station Whiskey Tango Foxtrot 9 Banana calling Admiral, what was his name again? Chryslerthorpe, called out Commander Flibber-Gibbet. "Right, Admiral Chryslerthorpe. This is an emergency communication from your fleet. Please respond if you can hear this." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then faintly, through the cosmic background noise, came a voice that sounded like someone gargling with gravel while hanging upside down. "This is Admiral Chryslerthorpe. Who is this, and how are you reaching me? I'm currently located in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and my communication systems can barely reach the next solar system." "This is Gleberton Fizzlebottom, amateur radio operator from planet Earth. Your fleet asked me to try to contact you. They're quite worried." There was a pause during which several small explosions could be heard in the background. "Did you just say you're calling from Earth, the planet we were supposed to invade?" "That's right, though from what I understand, the invasion isn't going particularly well." Another pause, longer this time. "Lieutenant Bloopenstein." Admiral Chryslerthorpe's voice was reaching the sort of pitch typically associated with air raid sirens. "Are you telling me that this primitive planet has communication technology superior to our entire invasion fleet?" "It would appear so, sir. This is quite embarrassing." Gleberton, who was beginning to enjoy his role as cosmic communications operator, keyed his microphone again. Admiral, your fleet is currently orbiting our planet and trying to figure out what happened to you. From what I can gather, you got sucked into a gravitational anomaly that relocated you somewhere far away. They're all quite worried and also somewhat panicked. Panicked? My elite invasion force is panicked? Well, yes. They seem to think we made you disappear with some kind of advanced weapon system. They're convinced we're more technologically advanced than we appear. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that several nearby galaxies stopped expanding just to listen. Finally, Admiral Kreslethorpe spoke in the sort of voice typically used by people who have just realized they've made a terrible mistake. Let me understand this correctly. My invasion fleet believes that your primitive planet has technology advanced enough to make starships disappear, but in reality, I was simply relocated by a natural phenomenon. That's about the size of it, yes. And you, a single Earth creature with hobby radio equipment, have better communication capabilities than my entire military force. Well, I wouldn't say better, exactly. Just different. And possibly more powerful due to some unusual circumstances involving underground mineral deposits and a modified microwave oven. Admiral Kreslethorpe was experiencing the sort of existential crisis typically reserved for people who discover their life's work has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Lieutenant Bluppenstein. Yes, sir. How long until this gravitational anomaly releases us? Approximately 13 rotations and 47 time units, sir. And how long until I can explain to High Command that our invasion failed because I got sucked into a cosmic sinkhole while my fleet was terrorized by a primitive planet's amateur radio enthusiast? The same amount of time, sir. Admiral Kreslethorpe made a sound that roughly translated to the galactic equivalent of someone banging their head against a wall while screaming. Back in the regular universe, Commander Flibbergibbet was experiencing his own existential crisis. So let me understand this, he said to his assembled officers. We came here to conquer a primitive planet. Our admiral was immediately removed from the battlefield by a natural phenomenon. We then spent several hours in terror of the planet's non-existent superweapons, while being counseled by one of their amateur hobbyists. That's pretty much it, sir, admitted Captain Binglebury. And now we have to wait nearly 2 weeks for our admiral to return so we can all go home and explain to our superiors that the mighty, invincible galactic fleet was defeated by bad luck and embarrassment. It does sound rather pathetic when you put it that way, sir. Commander Flibbergibbet stared out his view screen at the blue-green planet below, where millions of humans were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that they had just defeated an alien invasion through the simple expedient of existing near a gravitational anomaly. You know what the really embarrassing part is, he said finally. Sir, according to our original intelligence reports, this planet isn't even strategically important. We were only invading it because it was next on the list, and Admiral Kreslethorpe wanted to pad his conquest statistics. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of Lieutenant Nincompoop quietly sobbing into his tentacles. Down on Earth, Gleberton was having the most interesting evening of his life. He'd managed to establish regular communication with both the stranded admiral and his anxious fleet, and had somehow become the unofficial mediator in what was shaping up to be the galaxy's most embarrassing military incident. Admiral, this is Gleberton again. I've been talking with your fleet, and they're wondering if you need any supplies or assistance while you wait for the anomaly to release you. Supplies? Admiral Kreslethorpe's voice had taken on the sort of resignation typically heard from people stuck in very long lines at government offices. What kind of supplies could a primitive planet possibly provide to an advanced starship? Well, I don't know much about starships, but Commander Flibbergibbet mentioned that your food synthesizers were damaged when you got pulled into the anomaly. We've got plenty of food down here. I could probably arrange to have some delivered. You would send us food? Sure, it's the neighborly thing to do, plus I'm curious about how interplanetary food delivery would work. This could be the start of a whole new industry. Admiral Chryslerthorpe was quiet for a long moment. Earth creature. Gleberton, are you seriously offering to provide humanitarian aid to the military force that came here to conquer your planet? Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit odd. But you're stuck out there, you're hungry, and you're not actually conquering anyone at the moment. Seems like the decent thing to do. This statement hit Admiral Chryslerthorpe with the force of a philosophical freight train. In his 300 years of military service, he had conquered worlds, destroyed civilizations, and struck fear into the hearts of countless species. But he had never, not once, been offered a sandwich by his intended victims. This is highly irregular. Most good deeds are irregular, Admiral. That's what makes them good deeds instead of standard operating procedure. Commander Flibber Gibbet, who had been listening to this conversation, found himself experiencing something he'd never felt before, genuine fondness for a species he'd been planning to subjugate. Gleberton, this is Commander Flibber Gibbet. I have to ask, are all Earth creatures like you? Like me, how? Helpful, kind, willing to assist complete strangers who showed up planning to invade your planet? Gleberton considered this question while Mr. Whiskers climbed onto his lap and began purring. Well, we're not perfect. We've got our share of problems just like anyone else, I imagine, but most people try to help when they can. It's just what you do. This simple statement caused a profound shift in the collective consciousness of the alien fleet. These beings, who had spent their careers viewing other species as either threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited, suddenly found themselves confronted with the radical concept of unconditional kindness. Captain Bingleberry, whose worldview had already been thoroughly scrambled, whispered, "They're offering to feed us. After we came here to conquer them," added Ensign Dimwit. "And they're doing it because it's neighborly." Lieutenant Nincompoop sounded like someone trying to understand a foreign language. Over the next several days, something unprecedented in galactic history began to happen. The Galactic Invasion Fleet, stranded in orbit around a planet they'd come to conquer, found themselves becoming friends with the inhabitants. Gleberton had spread word of the situation through amateur radio networks, and soon radio operators around the world were taking turns communicating with the aliens. They shared information about Earth culture, answered questions about human society, and even organized a global effort to solve the aliens' food problem. "Admiral, this is Gleberton. I've got good news about the food situation." "Oh?" Admiral Chryslerthorpe had gradually warmed to these regular conversations, though he was still struggling with the ethical implications of accepting aid from people he'd intended to subjugate. "A group of amateur radio operators in Japan has figured out how to convert our food into a form your food synthesizers can process. They're working with some university physicists, and apparently they've made quite a breakthrough in matter energy conversion." Your people are collaborating with university scientists to help us? "Oh yes, everyone's quite excited about it. Dr. Yamamoto from Tokyo University says this could revolutionize food distribution worldwide. Plus, the radio club in Australia has been working on improving our communication range, and the folks in Germany think they can help boost your navigation systems." Admiral Chryslerthorpe found himself in the unprecedented position of having to process the concept of international cooperation, dedicated to helping an invasion force that had never actually managed to invade anything. "Gleberton, I must ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Of course, Admiral. Why are you helping us? We came here to conquer your planet. We intended to subjugate your species, and yet you're treating us like neighbors who ran into a bit of trouble?" "Exactly. It makes no sense from a strategic standpoint." Gleberton was quiet for a moment, scratching Mr. Whiskers behind the ears while considering his answer. "Well, Admiral, I suppose it comes down to this. You're not conquering anyone right now. You're just a bunch of folks stuck in space with broken food machines and a navigation problem. When someone needs help, you help them. It's really that simple. But we're your enemies. Are you, though? I mean, you haven't actually done anything hostile. You showed up, got immediately sucked into a cosmic pothole, and have been politely chatting with me ever since. If you're enemies, you're remarkably pleasant ones. This observation hit Admiral Creslerthorpe like a meteorite made of pure philosophical confusion. He had spent centuries defining himself as a conqueror, a destroyer of worlds, a force of inevitable domination. But when stripped of his overwhelming military superiority and stranded in the middle of nowhere, what was he actually? Apparently, he was someone who enjoyed talking about the weather with amateur radio enthusiasts. "Commander Flibbergibbet," the Admiral called out to his fleet, "I want you to run a full analysis of our invasion protocols. Sir, specifically, I want to know how many of our previous conquests involved species that offered to help us when we experienced technical difficulties." There was a pause while the commander consulted his records. "Sir, none of them. In fact, most species either fled in terror or immediately began shooting at us." "And how many of our target species possessed the technological capability to provide interstellar communication assistance?" "Again, sir, none of them. Most civilizations we've encountered have communication systems roughly equivalent to what we thought Earth's communication systems were like." Admiral Creslerthorpe was beginning to suspect that his career in galactic conquest had been built on a foundation of targeting the wrong planets for the wrong reasons. "Gleberton, this is Admiral Creslerthorpe again." "Hello, Admiral. How are you feeling today?" "Confused, mostly. I've been reviewing our invasion protocols, and I'm starting to think we may have been approaching interstellar relations from the wrong angle." "How so?" "Well, for starters, we've been operating under the assumption that superior military technology automatically makes us superior in all other ways. But your people have just demonstrated communication capabilities that exceed our own, solved our food synthesis problems in ways our own engineers couldn't manage, and are currently working on improving our navigation systems. That's what happens when you get a bunch of curious people working on interesting problems," Gleberton said cheerfully. "We may not have faster-than-light travel, but we're pretty good at figuring things out when we put our minds to it." "Yes, I'm beginning to understand that. Tell me, what would have happened if we had approached your planet peacefully instead of as conquerors?" Gleberton considered this question while watching Mr. Whiskers chase a dust mote around his garage. "Well, I imagine we would have been quite excited to meet you. First contact with an alien civilization would be the biggest news in human history. Scientists would be lining up to study your technology, and you'd probably have been invited to universities and conferences around the world." "Universities and conferences?" "Oh yes, we love learning about new things. Your faster-than-light travel technology alone would revolutionize our understanding of physics. Plus, cultural exchange programs, trade possibilities, collaborative research projects. The opportunities would be endless." Admiral Creslerthorpe was experiencing what psychologists call a paradigm shift, which is the mental equivalent of discovering that everything you thought you knew about the universe was actually just a very convincing hallucination. So instead of conquest and subjugation, you would have offered friendship and collaboration. "Well, yes, why would we want to fight with people who could teach us to travel between the stars?" This question hung in the cosmic void like a particularly uncomfortable truth. Admiral Creslerthorpe had spent 3 centuries believing that the only way to interact with other species was through domination and control. The concept of voluntary cooperation for mutual benefit was so foreign to his worldview that his brain was making small whimpering sounds while trying to process it. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the global amateur radio community had essentially adopted the stranded alien fleet as their favorite project. Radio operators from every continent were taking shifts, maintaining communication, and the collaborative effort to help their unexpected cosmic visitors had sparked a renaissance in international cooperation. Dr. Yamamoto from Tokyo University had successfully transmitted the molecular structure of basic nutrients to the aliens' food synthesizers. The Australian Radio Club had developed a signal amplification technique that allowed near-instantaneous communication across interstellar distances. The German engineering team had figured out how to recalibrate the aliens' navigation systems to account for gravitational anomalies. And in a small garage in Bumblefork, Gleberton Fizzlebottom had accidentally become Earth's first interstellar diplomat. "Admiral, this is Gleberton with your daily update." "Hello, Gleberton. I look forward to these conversations more than I should probably admit." "Well, I've got good news and interesting news. Which would you like first?" "Let's start with the good news. The gravitational anomaly holding you is beginning to weaken. According to Dr. Chen at the Beijing Institute of Theoretical Physics, you should be free to return to normal space within the next 3 days." "That is good news. What's the interesting news?" "Well, the global radio community has been so energized by this whole situation that they've formed something called the Earth-Space Communication Consortium. They're proposing to establish permanent communication links with any friendly alien civilizations who might be interested in cultural and scientific exchange. Admiral Chryslerthorpe felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: genuine excitement about the future. They want to maintain contact after we leave. "Oh yes, everyone's been having such a wonderful time working on these technical challenges. Plus, there's been talk about student exchange programs, collaborative research projects, maybe even tourism once we figure out the logistics." "Tourism? Well, why not? I bet there are plenty of humans who would love to see other worlds, and I imagine some of your people might be curious about Earth. We've got some pretty impressive natural wonders, and our food is apparently much better than we realized." This conversation was being monitored by Commander Flibbergibbet and his officers, who were experiencing their own paradigm shifts. The idea that they might return to Earth not as conquerors, but as tourists, was so fundamentally different from their military training that several of them had begun experiencing what could only be described as career's existential crises. "Sir," Captain Bingleberry said quietly, "what are we going to tell High Command when we get back?" Commander Flibbergibbet had been dreading this question. "How do you explain to your military superiors that your invasion failed because your admiral got sucked into a cosmic sinkhole and your fleet spent 2 weeks being helped by the very people you were supposed to conquer?" "I've been thinking about that," he said finally, "and I believe we need to recommend a complete revision of our first contact protocols. Sir, think about it. We've learned more about effective interstellar relations in the past week than we did in 3 centuries of conquest. These humans have demonstrated that voluntary cooperation produces better results than forced subjugation. But, sir, High Command isn't going to want to hear that their entire military philosophy is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how to interact with other species. No, they're not. But that doesn't change the fact that it's true." Lieutenant Nincompoop, whose name was becoming increasingly inaccurate as he developed genuine strategic insights, spoke up. "Sir, what if we don't frame it as a failure? What if we present it as a successful first contact mission that established peaceful relations with a strategically valuable ally?" Commander Flibbergibbet stared at his subordinate with the expression of someone who had just watched their pet goldfish solve a complex mathematical equation. "Lieutenant, that's actually brilliant." "Thank you, sir. I've been thinking that these humans could be incredibly valuable partners. Their communication technology is more advanced than ours. Their problem-solving capabilities are impressive, and they've demonstrated a remarkable ability to coordinate global efforts for common goals. Plus," added Ensign Dimwit, who was also demonstrating previously hidden depths, "they seem genuinely interested in peaceful cooperation. That's got to be worth more than another subjugated planet that resents our presence." Captain Bingleberry was nodding enthusiastically. "And consider the long-term implications. If we can establish Earth as our first peaceful ally, it could serve as a model for future first contact situations. Instead of expensive military campaigns, we could have willing partners. Commander Flibbergibbet felt a strange sensation that he eventually identified as hope. You know, this could actually work. We return to High Command with a successful diplomatic mission instead of a failed invasion. We've established contact with a technologically innovative species willing to share their knowledge and expertise. And, Lieutenant Nincompoop added with growing excitement, we've discovered that voluntary cooperation produces better results than conquest. This could revolutionize how the Galactic Confederation approaches interstellar relations. Meanwhile, Admiral Chryslerthorpe was having his own revelations in the depths of space. Lieutenant Blupenstein. Yes, sir. I want you to compile a complete report on everything we've learned from our interactions with the humans. Everything, sir? Everything. Their communication capabilities, problem-solving methods, collaborative techniques, and especially their approach to helping complete strangers who showed up with hostile intentions. That's going to be quite a comprehensive report, sir. Good. Because I intend to present it to High Command as evidence that our current military doctrine is fundamentally flawed. Lieutenant Blupenstein paused in his data compilation. Sir, are you sure that's wise? High Command doesn't typically respond well to suggestions that they've been wrong about, well, everything. Lieutenant, in the past week, I've learned more about effective leadership and interspecies relations than I did in 3 centuries of military conquest. These humans have taught us that strength isn't about who has the biggest weapons or the most intimidating starships. It's about who can solve problems, adapt to new situations, and build meaningful relationships with others. That's a very different philosophy from our traditional approach, sir. Yes, it is, and it's also demonstrably more effective. When was the last time one of our conquered species offered to help us when we experienced technical difficulties? Never, sir. Exactly. Because when you conquer someone, you create enemies. But when you approach them as potential friends and partners, you create allies. And allies are infinitely more valuable than subjects. Back on Earth, the final preparations were being made for the aliens' return to normal space. The global radio network had established permanent monitoring stations to maintain communication once the fleet departed, and several universities had begun developing curricula for interstellar cultural studies. Gleberton, who had become something of a celebrity in amateur radio circles, was making his final scheduled communication with Admiral Chryslerthorpe. Admiral, this is Gleberton with what I believe will be our last conversation before you're free to return home. Hello, Gleberton. I want you to know that these conversations have been the highlight of my entire career, actually. That's very kind of you to say, Admiral. It's been quite an adventure for me, too. I never imagined that my little radio hobby would lead to interstellar diplomacy. Gleberton, I need to ask you something important. Of course, Admiral. When we return to our space, and when I make my report to High Command, would you be willing to serve as Earth's official representative for ongoing diplomatic relations? Gleberton nearly dropped his coffee cup. What, me? Admiral, I'm just a retired electronics technician with a garage full of surplus radio equipment. And you're also the most effective diplomat I've ever encountered. You've managed to turn what should have been a hostile invasion into a successful first contact mission. You've coordinated global efforts to solve complex technical problems, and you've demonstrated that peaceful cooperation produces better results than military conquest. Well, when you put it that way. Plus, you have the trust of your people and the respect of my fleet. There's no one I'd rather work with to establish formal relations between our species. Gleberton looked around his cluttered garage, at his makeshift radio equipment held together with electrical tape and optimism, at Mr. Whiskers, who was demonstrating his opinion of galactic diplomacy by taking a nap in a box of spare vacuum tubes. Admiral, I'd be honored to help establish formal diplomatic relations, though I should probably warn you that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing." "Neither did I, Gleberton. Neither did I. But we figured it out together, didn't we?" "Yes, I suppose we did." 3 days later, the gravitational anomaly finally released Admiral Chryslerthorpe and his flagship. Instead of returning immediately to Earth to continue their invasion, the Admiral made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He ordered his fleet to return home. Not in defeat, but in triumph. They had successfully established peaceful first contact with a previously unknown species. They had demonstrated that diplomatic solutions could be more effective than military ones, and they had laid the groundwork for what would become the galaxy's first voluntary interstellar alliance. The report that Admiral Chryslerthorpe presented to High Command was unlike anything in military history. Instead of casualty reports and conquest statistics, it contained detailed analyses of collaborative problem-solving techniques, cultural exchange protocols, and the strategic advantages of voluntary cooperation. High Command's initial reaction was, predictably, confusion and skepticism. But when the Admiral demonstrated the advanced communication technologies that Earth's amateur radio operators had helped them develop, when he showed them the improved navigation systems that human engineers had refined, and when he presented them with food synthesis improvements that their own scientists hadn't been able to achieve, skepticism gave way to fascination. Within 6 months, the Galactic Confederation had established its first Department of Peaceful First Contact, with Admiral Chryslerthorpe as its director and Gleberton Fizzlebottom as Earth's official interstellar relations coordinator. The success of the Earth model led to a revolution in how the Confederation approached other species. Instead of conquest and subjugation, they began offering partnership and collaboration. Species that had previously been seen as threats or resources were suddenly potential allies and teachers, and it all started because an incompetent computer misidentified Earth's defensive capabilities. A gravitational anomaly relocated an invasion fleet, and a retired electronics technician in Bumblefork decided that helping stranded strangers was simply the neighborly thing to do. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor after all. Years later, when Earth had become the diplomatic center of the Galactic Confederation and Gleberton's garage had been converted into the headquarters of the Interstellar Communication Authority, people would ask him how he'd managed to single-handedly prevent an alien invasion and establish peaceful relations with dozens of species. Gleberton would always give the same answer, usually while scratching Mr. Whiskers behind the ears and adjusting some piece of equipment that probably shouldn't work, but somehow did. "I didn't prevent anything. I just answered the radio when it rang and tried to be helpful when someone needed assistance. Everything else sort of happened on its own." And that, as it turned out, was the most profound diplomatic philosophy in galactic history. When someone calls for help, you answer the phone and try to be useful, even if they originally called to conquer your planet.